Hello friends, we're going to try to do it this way today because of the snow, and I'd hate to see any of you driving in this. So there is a discussion forum that I'm going to ask you to do today that really looks at being responsive in society's needs and how do we organize teaching. So it's going to ask you to post a prompt, watch a short video, and then respond to two of your peers. So all that's there for you to go ahead and get started on this afternoon. And then I want to make sure that I highlight some of the really important pieces today I was going to talk about in class and we'll be building on. In terms of your posters, we'll take care of those presentations when we return next week. So today we really were going to focus on that question after we looked at, what knowledge is most worth knowing. How do we decide what we teach and who decides what the students learn? Basically, how do we decide for teachers in the public school classroom, what are we going to teach our students? And for folks that are outside of public school classrooms, how do you know what to teach? So really looking at where our students are. I want to do a quick intro. I know some of you said you had a little bit of understanding of our Oregon standards, but let me give you a little bit of background. So we know that schools are a microcosm of the larger culture, both from our local district, our states, and our federal culture. So that membrane between our school and what's happening outside of our school is very thin. And you could see that, those of you that have been in practicums, you can be in Ashland School and same state standards, but you can see it looks really different than maybe driving down the road to a different school in Ashland, or maybe driving a little further down the road to a school in Phoenix or Talent and in Medford. A good example is I walked into a school, and the first thing I see when I walk in that school is a great big display case of trophies. So it really shows what that school values. Another school I walk into, you walk straight into the media library lounge. Another school you might walk into, the big R's of respect and responsibility. So looking at an artifact level, really being that ethnographic researcher, what norms, values do you see and philosophies that are really embraced by that school? Chances are it'll be very similar to the norms, values that the community where that school sits in. So keeping that in mind, we'll look at that big question, really, who decides what is taught in our schools and where do we get there? So first of all, let me make it very clear, this will be on the midterm and the final, we do not have national standards. That's a pretty big deal because we are one of the only first world countries that do not have national standards. Canada has national standards, Mexico has national standards, we do not. We do have Common Core standards, which are not federally enforced, but they are kind of a common standard that states can adopt and tweak to be their state standards. So the jurisdiction of what's taught in public schools lies within the state, and that goes back to the Constitution that clarifies that that is something that remains at the state level. And the reason behind that is, for a long time, whether it's relevant today or not, that's a whole other conversation. But what folks might need to be successful, what the students need to solve the problems of today's world in that state might look really different than what someone might need in another state. For example, folks in Oregon, they're going to be successful, and graduates in the state of Oregon may need different kind of knowledge, skills, and understandings than folks who might live in Florida. So with that said, where do states get their state standards? They get them from professional organizations, and these are national organizations. These are things like the National Organization of the Arts, the National Society of Geography, the National Society of Mathematics, the Professional Organization of Health and PE. So there's hundreds of them out there, and some impact the state standards more than others, but getting on these are the best and the brightest of that particular discipline. It's those that are doing the discipline, it's those that are teaching the discipline, and there's some politics involved. So enough of that, we'll get into it. So what are state standards and how do we get them? As I mentioned before, we have the Common Core Standards. These were put together by the big professional organizations. It was a collaboration of folks within that discipline. So, for example, English language arts, we had the International Reading Association. There was the teaching of writing, professional writing projects. A number of groups, professional organizations got together and created Common Core State Standards. Same thing happened with mathematics and now with science, and that is NGSS is the new generation of science standards. So I will say that this is a process that's continually being revised, and we'll talk about it. But for the state of Oregon, first of all, we're one of the very last states in the nation to actually adopt state standards. Montana, Oregon, really, I think, with the last two. And the reason being is that we don't have state taxes. So there's not a lot of funding that went into this. And there's the rogueness, no pun intended. So states, they basically have a similar process that we did in class the other day. They have, I was actually working in the Department of Education in California on the social studies standards when California was looking at adopting revising standards. Yes, I'm that old. The different, for example, the Department of History, they get together and they basically reach up to these big standards that professional organizations put forth, saying everyone who graduates high school in the state, in the nation, should walk away knowing, doing, and being able to understand this about this content area. So each state goes up and looks at these and pulls these down and basically says, okay, we are going to adopt these recommendations from the professional organization standards as our state standard. So if you're a school within that state, a public accredited school, you are required by law to teach to those state standards. Okay? Now, in each state, we have districts, and the districts, for them to be accredited districts and their schools within the districts, they must teach to the state standards, but they can add to those standards. So, for example, let's look at Klamath City and County. Klamath City schools looked at their state standards and they said, you know what, there's just not enough technology. So they went to the it's ESTE standards. These are the International Standards of Technology and Education, something I can't remember. Anyway, they went to those standards and they added to the state standards for the district. So schools within that district of Klamath City must teach to the district standards, which teach to the state standards, which come from the professional organizations. County schools in Klamath, they didn't add the technology standards, but they did look and they say, you know what, our students in this district, they need to have a better understanding of ag science and environmental education. So they went up to those professional organizations and added standards to the state standards to those district standards. So two districts very close together, both teach to the state standards, but they also have added to those in the district standards. Now schools within the district must teach to the must teach to the district standards, which also teach to the state standards, which come from the professional organizations. You're starting to see that, right? Okay. So those schools, if you've ever been on a site council or been involved in the school plan, can also add to the district standards. An example of that would be the school right down the hill from campus, John Muir. They are a public elementary, actually K-8 school in the Ashland School District, but they actually are a magnet school. They added additional art standards. So they looked at the art standards and they said not enough, went back to the professional organizations, looked at those standards and added to those lists. They did the same thing with environmental education. So to be an employed teacher at that school, You are required and hired to teach to the school plan, which teaches to the district standards, which teaches to the state standards, which comes from the professional organization. The last thing I'll say on this is that when the door closes, as teachers, we also add to that question, what knowledge is most worth knowing and who decides what we teach. And that is based on the population of our schools, of our classroom. It's based on our own passion and interest. And it's based on the current need of what's happening that day in our classrooms. So a couple notes for you to take a look at just to highlight some of the comments that I made. And also to just reiterate the fact that each state shifts through those professional standards to decide on both the explicit and the null curriculum.